Hello, everyone, and welcome to our MintCast live stream. It's a video show featuring dissenting voices the establishment would rather silence. I am your host, Mnar Adley, founder and editor-in-chief of MintPress News. We are currently live today on YouTube, on Twitch, on Twitter, and on Facebook on our MintPress channels. So hope that you can join us here today. And if you are asking or inquiring if this video will be available later on, this video will be available on our channels as well, and as a podcast on our iTunes and Spotify channels. And obviously, we would appreciate all of your support in supporting this live stream and all of our podcasts by becoming a member on our Patreon page for MintPress News. Well, we have a lot to talk about today. One of the biggest stories that have erupted this week has been the Cuba protests. And I have two very special and very important guests who are experts on the subject matter, joining me to break through the media propaganda machine on the Cuba protests that are only working to promote regime change. And so we'll get right to it. We have Benjamin Norton joining us today, a very special guest. Very excited to have him. He's the editor at The Gray Zone. He's also a journalist.
Assistant editor, yeah. Max Blumenthal is the editor.
Okay. Assistant editor at The Gray Zone. And he's based in Nicaragua as well. And then we have MacLeod, who is a propaganda scholar. We're so honored to work with him. He's also our senior staff writer at MintPress News. And so, Ben, I want to just get right into it and start with you. What has been your reaction to the protests? I mean, can you break down what these protests consist of in Cuba?
Great. Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. MintPress is one of the best outlets, and it's always a pleasure to speak with you all and be part of your work. What's going on in Cuba right now is really similar to what has gone on in numerous left-wing governments in Latin America. It's clearly a kind of destabilization operation, and it's part of a kind of manual. In fact, the irony of the hashtag that is the kind of slogan of this AstroTurf campaign, SOS Cuba, is the exact same hashtag that was used to try to destabilize Nicaragua, here where I am right now, in 2018, and the Sandinista government, which is a close ally of Cuba, of course. And the U.S. government declared that Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua are the so-called troika of tyranny, sometimes actually referred to as the troika of resistance. They're the three longest ruling socialist governments in Latin America and have anti-imperialist foreign policy and free healthcare and education for people and strong social programs. And they serve as a threat of a good example for the United States. The U.S. has dedicated billions and billions of dollars to destabilizing these countries. And in the case of Cuba, not only is it a matter of destabilization, it's a matter of 60 years of a nonstop terror war that Washington has waged on this small island nation of just 11 million people, and a criminal blockade. Since 1960, roughly 1960 or 1961, the U.S. has imposed illegal unilateral sanctions that became a blockade, an economic embargo of Cuba. And this prevents Cuba not only from being able to do business with the United States, that's a small part of it. And if you listen to some of these people in the mainstream corporate media talk about the blockade, that's what they think it is. It's much worse than that. It really is a kind of medieval blockade, because not only can Cuba not do business with the United States, but Cuba is prevented from doing business with many countries around the world and many firms and companies and organizations around the world that fear what are called secondary sanctions, because the U.S. government says that if a country or a firm does business with Cuba, the U.S. government can threaten that country or that firm with sanctions for supposedly violating U.S. sanctions on Cuba. So this is a de facto medieval blockade. It's gone on for over 60 years. The entire international community is opposed to it. It's really important to stress that. And actually, if I can share my screen here, I just want to show, just to get some context when we're talking about Cuba, it's really important, I think, to talk about like what other countries are saying, because so much in mainstream corporate media, they only talk about the US, right? And the reality is that 184 nations in the United Nations almost every single country on earth just voted against this illegal U.S. blockade. If this screen sharing works, I'm going to try to, hopefully this, I don't know if you all can see that there. There we go. Yeah. 184 countries just voted against the illegal U.S. blockade of Cuba. There were only 2 countries that voted in support of the blockade, of course, the U.S. and apartheid Israel, the 51st state. And then there were 3 abstentions. And those abstentions were the far-right narco regime in Colombia, the far-right Bolsonaro regime in Brazil, and the far-right Ukrainian regime, which is infiltrated by neo-Nazis and which is trying to join NATO. So we're talking about an illegal criminal blockade that has gone on for 60 years. Everyone in the world knows what's happening. Everyone in the world knows that it's the U.S. violating international law. But of course, there's so much fake news, there's so much propaganda, which we can talk about. And of course, Alan is an expert on propaganda and fake news, so I'll leave him to do that. But in terms of the political context, we have to understand that, yes, there are some economic difficulties in Cuba, but those are almost entirely caused by the illegal criminal U.S. blockade with the express intention of destroying the country. And there's one other final thing I just want to mention here before pivoting back to you all, if I can share my screen again. And that's that the explicitly stated goal of the U.S. blockade is to destroy the Cuban economy. That's not my opinion. That is what the U.S. government has internally admitted. So after the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, and immediately after in 1960, a internal State Department cable, which is now published by the Office of the Historian, it's publicly available, admitted that the majority of Cubans supported Castro in the revolution, and there is no effective political opposition. So what was their response? Their response was the same response of Richard Nixon when the socialist Salvador Allende won the election freely and fairly in Chile. The response of the U.S. government after 1970 was, quote, make the economy scream. That's what Kissinger and Nixon said. And here, it's the same exact policy a decade before, in 1960, the U.S. State Department said, quote, the only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. And then the U.S. State Department cable continues saying that every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba, adding that they should make the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. They say that openly: hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. The U.S. government is intentionally using this blockade and these sanctions to create hunger and desperation with the goal of overthrowing the government. They've been doing that for 60 years. They're doing it as well in Venezuela and Iran and many countries, and that's exactly what's going on right now in Cuba too.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you talked about this context. I mean, you really laid down the groundwork of the framework of what the propaganda campaign has been for Cuba by the United States. I just want to read out a statement really quick here that came out from the White House, that we stand with the Cuban people and their clarion call for freedom and relief from the tragic grip of the pandemic and from the decades of repression and economic suffering to which they have been subjected to by Cuba's authoritarian regime. And so, as you can see, the narrative by the White House and by the U.S. political class has been completely flipped upside down to paint the Cuban government as the oppressor, while the United States is just sweeping in like that bald eagle, just coming in to bring in some good old-fashioned freedom to the Cuban people. And so I want to talk about the protests, because right now the Western corporate media, especially in the United States, has been headlining with these protests and promoting them as the need for regime change, and socialism is very bad. Yet a lot of these protesters are waving the American flag. And we all know what happens when America comes in and swoops in and brings that kind of freedom and regime change. And yet on another note, a lot of the images that have been shown, apart from the ones from the smaller protests with the American flag, some of these images of mass protests have actually been pro-Cuban government demonstrations, basically telling the United States to leave them alone and we support the Cuban government. Yet the US media has been using these mass protests, these images coming out of Cuba, as evidence of anti-Cuban government protests. So, Alan, I want you to kind of tell me who these protesters are, and if you can, explain to us how Western media has painted them, apart from, expand on what I just explained.
Yeah, sure. I suppose they started on Sunday and they were pretty small. They started in a town relatively close to Havana in the west side of Cuba. And it seems that they started because of a lack of food and medicines that is going on. If you read the media, that will be solely attributed to the faults of the Cuban government, or maybe because socialism inherently doesn't work. But as Ben said earlier, one of the key driving factors in Cuba's economic problems right now is this enormous blockade from the world's sole superpower, which is stopping companies trading with Cuba. It's stopping ships entering Cuban waters. It really effectively has the outcome of strangling a population very slowly. That's what Cubans talk about, the asphyxiation. So I think, first of all, there is plenty of reason to feel that there are justified reasons to protest in Cuba. There are shortages of goods, there are shortages of medicines. And it may well be that this protest did start that way, a real grassroots thing that was relatively small in one place. But it was immediately picked up upon by people in the US. There was an interesting little discussion on MSNBC. They brought on the head of NBC Latin America. And she said that the protesters started talking with their friends in Miami and Florida. And from there, it got massively signal boosted across the island, across the United States, to the point where, the president of the United States was tweeting about it. Everyone in the Republican Party was immediately lining up to denounce Joe Biden as being soft on communism, even though he released that statement, which made it absolutely clear that he was supporting these protests. Media stars and, pop singers like Pitbull were putting out stuff saying SOS Cuba. And so while it may have started possibly as a genuine grassroots movement, although we don't really know that, the fact that it kind of took over Cuba was not natural in the slightest. But even when we talk about it, this wasn't actually, in the grand scheme of things, such a massive protest. Some of the numbers are saying that there might have been a few hundred in Havana and maybe a few thousand across Cuba. But, compared to what we've seen in the US, where tens of millions of people went on marches last year, this is really small potatoes. And what I really think this shows is, maybe if this is all the United States has got in terms of its massive clout, if all it's got is the ability to get a couple of thousand people on the streets, many of whom might have actually been protesting about something quite different and not supported their agenda. I was speaking to one professor earlier today who said that quite a lot of people who were protesting were saying things like, well, they're building hotels for the rich, but they're not, providing for us. So they were actually, some of the protesters seem to be taking a much more sort of ultra left position in terms of criticizing the government from the left. So, yeah, as you said, the media has hyped this up into this worldwide spectacular where it trends on Twitter for more than 24 hours. But ultimately, it doesn't really go anywhere. As you said, there are absolutely outrageous things going on in the media, promoting fake news, showing pictures of protests in Buenos Aires or in Egypt and pretending that they're from Cuba. Or, we saw outlets like CNN and National Geographic use pictures of sympathy demonstrations among the reactionary community in Miami and strongly insinuating that those were actually taken from Cuba. The actual images of these protests that have come out, through cell phone coverage shows that they're not really enormous and they haven't really been brutally repressed. And as we said before, some of the pictures, the counter demonstrations certainly seem to be much larger. And that's where the press has really gotten their foot stuck in it, where they're actually showing pictures of pro-government demonstrations and claiming that they're counter demonstrations. So I think this whole thing, once we write the autopsy on it, might be like a mountain out of a molehill. We've seen this in Venezuela and other Latin American countries before, where these small protests get hyped, whereas the big protests that are happening right now, like the national strike in Colombia, which has gone on for months, has got barely any coverage. Or the fact that Haiti has been in this low level, civil war, government versus people for 3 years since 2018. Got barely any coverage until the president, the US-backed dictator, Jovenel Moïse, was killed earlier this month. So I think that might be the case where this is really a kind of a mediatic coup, which ultimately didn't go very far.
Well, I really like that you described it as a media coup because, there are so many big issues taking place, like in Yemen, for example, where 23 million people are on the brink of starvation. And the Western corporate media, if it truly, truly cared about human rights, democracy, or had any sense of humanity, the first thing that they would be covering would be the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. Or it would be also covering the humanitarian crisis in Haiti, where the United States has been plundering and occupying this, this tiny island nation for so long. And, it's basically been an outpost for Western imperialism and corporations to plunder this nation, and also for the UN peacekeepers to, violate so many human rights there. And then in Cuba, we have the national strike that has been taking place for over a month now. And the police have literally been raping protesters.
In Colombia, not Cuba.
In Colombia, I'm sorry, in Colombia, that's what I meant to say. In Colombia, and the media has literally barely even touched on the subject. I think Mint Press and like the Gray Zone have been some of the very few media outlets who have been actually covering what's taking place there. So there is clearly a media coup taking place. Ben, I'm curious to know if you think that the United States is going to use these small protests and attempt to spark a color revolution. It's very clear that with the demonstrations that are happening in Miami, it kind of feels that way. What do you think about that?
The U.S. is always trying to spark a so-called color revolution in Cuba. It's tried hundreds and hundreds of times over decades. I want to remind people that the U.S. has also waged a terrorist war. There's no other word for it, against Cuba, similar to the terrorist war it's waged against Nicaragua, the Sandinista government here, and against Venezuela. We've seen these violent attacks. Let's not forget that in 1976, CIA-backed and trained Cuban terrorists blew up a civilian Cuban airliner, massacring dozens of civilians. And they bombed dozens of hotels and other businesses in Cuba with the goal of killing civilians, especially tourists, targeting tourists to try to destroy the tourism industry in Cuba, because tourism is an important source of revenue. And related to the protests going on right now, one of the reasons that there are some economic difficulties that are more so than in the past few years, because of course the blockade has gone on for 60 years, is because of COVID, of course. The COVID lockdown measures have really hurt the economy, and the blockade has prevented Cuba from buying syringes and buying certain medicines and medical equipment. And it's also starved the government of tourism revenue and the local economy of tourism revenue, which is a really important source, not only of money, but also it's a source of hard foreign currency, which Cuba needs to do business to the extent that it can do business with other countries. It needs foreign currencies, especially dollars, because the US dollar is the de facto global currency reserve. The US has this chokehold on the international economic system. So the COVID pandemic has really decimated the tourism sector in Cuba, which has compounded the economic problems caused by the US blockade. But getting back to the color revolution attempts, I mean, the US, let's not forget, the US invaded Cuba in the so-called Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a terrorist invasion of the country, similar to the attempted terrorist invasion of Venezuela in last year in May, the so-called Operation Gideon. And let's not forget that the CIA, on the books, we know that the CIA and other U.S. government agencies orchestrated at least 638 assassination attempts just against Fidel Castro. There are more assassination attempts against Fidel Castro than almost anyone else in human history, which says a lot about how much this small country in the Caribbean, Cuba, how much of a so-called threat it is, in scare quotes, to U.S. imperialism. I mean, it actually is a threat to U.S. imperialism, not to the American people, but it says so much that the U.S. has spent so many billions of dollars trying to destabilize and overthrow this government. But in terms of what's going on right now, there are so many similarities to what happened in Nicaragua in 2018. And for people who don't know, it's not as well known. the Nicaraguan government right now, where I live, where I am, it's a Sandinista government, which is a very close ally of Cuba, a revolutionary anti-imperialist socialist government. And they came back to power in 2007 through democratic elections. And they've been in power since 2007. So, and also, of course, the Chavista government in Venezuela. Those are the three, strongest allies, socialist allies in Latin America. And they work together a lot. And there's a lot of similarities in the U.S. tactics they use to destabilize these governments. And in 2018, there were these protests that began, which are pretty similar to the protests we're seeing now in Cuba. And what happened is they were very small protests in April 2018. And there was this narrative that was constructed, which is similar to the misleading, disingenuous narrative we've seen about Cuba. And the narrative we've seen in Cuba is supposedly that the government COVID response has been bad, that the Cuba supposedly botched the COVID response, which is hilarious coming from the United States, where 600,000 people died. And it's also hilarious considering that actually the three countries in Latin America with the best COVID response in terms of the fewest deaths just so happened to be the so-called troika of tyranny, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, because these are socialized health systems where you can go to that hospital for free. You don't pay a single cent. I have friends in Nicaragua. A friend of mine, his mother had cancer and she got all of her chemotherapy, all of her treatment, and never paid a single penny. So it's not surprising that actually Cuba had one of the best COVID responses, but there's these misleading narratives. And similarly, in Nicaragua, there was this absurd narrative that the government was trying to cut Social Security for poor people, a totally blatant lie. The people protesting were actually pushing for neoliberal IMF reforms, and they were backed by the U.S. government and the Chamber of Commerce here in Nicaragua. So what happens is not only is there all the fake news on social media, not only are there tons of bot accounts spreading. Here in Nicaragua, it was SOS Nicaragua. In Cuba, it was SOS Cuba, the same campaign, same manual. But also what they're trying to do is they're trying to confuse progressive-minded young millennials who say, oh, well, I mean, maybe there are legitimate grievances. Maybe the government did botch COVID. Maybe the government isn't spending on healthcare. It's insane propaganda, but it has an impact on young people. And that's the target of these operations. And if you look at the protests in Cuba, they're targeting young people who use social media, who use Instagram and Facebook, or not Facebook really anymore, Instagram and Twitter and TikTok. That's where all this propaganda is. And that's why finally they're going after celebrities. They're trying to get all of these celebrities to tweet SOS Cuba, these actors, these musicians. And this whole thing started with this former porn actress. What's her name? Mia something? And
Mia Khalifa.
She's the one that it started with. And she was tweeting all this stuff. And it's clear that she's being paid or being supported by right-wing Cuban forces because she's been tweeting like Cuban slang. There's this term this is insult in Cuban slang, singao. There's no way she would know that term. It's a very specific Cuban slang term. So that's why if you look at all the bots, they're trying to get all of these celebrities to go on board because their strategy for this manual, the soft coup manual, is they have all the bots just spam celebrities to try to get celebrities to speak out so then they can have media coverage saying the celebrity spoke out. So then young people who follow these social media influencers and celebrities will think that there's some kind of progressive uprising going on in the country and that the young millennials will say, we have to support the moderate rebels or whatever.
Right. Well, and we have this problem here in the U.S., as you know, we talk about this a lot with like the hipster, neoliberal, so-called, hipster propaganda outlets like, Vice News, BuzzFeed. We have the same problem here. And they're actually also promoting a lot of this regime change talking points through their news outlets because they're receiving many of their information directly from the State Department and through the Board of Broadcasting Governors, which is a legal propaganda arm of the United States government, which is funded through our taxpayer money. And so, I'm seeing definitely a trend and a correlation with that. And I'm curious to know, Alan, who some of these rappers are, and if you can talk a little bit about the history of rappers and artists being used to sponsor, U.S. propaganda for regime change and the celebrities I want to talk more about the celebrities that are pushing out these narratives.
Yeah, sure. There's a lot of Miami-based rappers or rappers inside of Cuba which have come out in support of these protests. In fact, they seem to be almost leading them. One of the key figures is Yotuel, who is Cuban, but he left, emigrated to Miami, now lives a very comfortable life there as like Grammy award-winning or Grammy-nominated winning artist. He was one of the people who really spoke out about it early on. He led a demonstration in Miami. Marco Rubio tweeted this out. He said, it's really telling, just to what Ben was talking about, it's really telling that that these protests are not being led by activists, they're being led by artists. But what Marco Rubio isn't telling people is that the US has been targeting the artistic community, particularly the musical community, and in particular inside of that, the hip hop community, for decades now. If you go to the NED or the USAID's website, these two sister organizations which act essentially as a front for the CIA, putting money into all sorts of different countries for various soft power tactics, you'll see that a lot of their grants are aimed at young people and in particular at the artistic community, because they think that music and art and architecture, things that young people like, dancing, etc., journalism, will be the way of trying to co-opt and change the minds of young Cubans. And the hip hop community has really been part of that movement for a long time. Hip hop really exploded in Cuba in the late 90s, early 2000s. It has a very sort of unique feel to it because, it's kind of being made to go through a sort of forced isolation. And so that means that the music kind of flourishes and develops on its own. The US forces like the NED and USAID had been for a long time trying to co-opt this movement because, I suppose hip hop really became a really important thing in Cuba because they were talking about things that before had largely been kind of sidelined, things like racial issues. And the US really saw that as a potential great way of trying to, knock a wedge between different parts of society. And I'm not sure how much, actual success they've had, but they've certainly been able to co-opt. They've certainly been able to co-opt a lot of well-known rappers who have now been, talking about this, speaking out. When we talk about, artists leading this protest, we have to, put a little asterisk next to that, saying that actually a lot of these artists are directly in the pay of the American forces like the USAID or the NED, but that's never really talked about in any of the coverage in the West or, even on social media. We've seen incredible amounts of retweets of SOS Cuba from these artists, but where it actually started was a Spanish-based individual who tweeted it, I think, on Sunday. And since then, analysis has shown that he's been retweeting SOS Cuba tweets or putting them out at least at a rate of 5 times per second for over 24 hours, according to one Spanish journalist who looked into that. Now, that obviously is going to raise the profile of that and turn it into the #1 trend worldwide. A lot of the bot networks seem to be very, very crude. Everybody's tweeting out literally the same topics, literally the same sentences, which are just sort of cut and pasted. There are thousands of these, people tweeting the same thing in Spanish with SOS Cuba at the end. And yet Twitter doesn't really seem to be interested in doing anything about it. In fact, quite the opposite. The editorial team decided to put the Cuban protests at the top of the What's Happening sidebar for over 24 hours, which really elevated this protest and made people worldwide, and particularly in the United States, think that this protest was far more significant than it was. And I think that was precisely the idea behind it, because certainly in the past few years, we've seen Twitter becoming increasingly close to the US government, deleting accounts that are pro-Cuban government or really any enemy state of the United States. We've seen Twitter deleting, literally hundreds of thousands of Chinese accounts, which most of us will never see because they're tweeting in Mandarin or Cantonese, or Iranian accounts or Venezuelan accounts, even to the point where they're suspending or deleting heads of state of foreign countries that the US doesn't like. So I think a lot of the time we have to start thinking about social media as being increasingly indistinguishable from the national security state, which tries to keep it slightly at arm's length, but ultimately they seem to be working in harmony on this issue.
And I think that's a really good point, because now Twitter and all of these social media giants are the tech overlords that rule over us now are an arm of the U.S. war machine and the weapons manufacturers and the think tanks. And the foreign governments, the dictatorships in apartheid Israel. I mean, think about Marco Rubio, who's given unlimited, airtime to talk about Cuba and to promote regime change. And he was the guy who tweeted out threatening Maduro with the same fate as Gaddafi, who was sodomized and dragged through the streets of Libya, the leader of Libya. And so this guy, Marco Rubio, who claims to be, a Christian, he's literally threatening another leader with assassination and bloodshed. And he is given unlimited airtime on these social media platforms to promote violence, while people like us are constantly, independent journalists and activists for peace and inclusion are, regularly, we're throttled, we're shadow banned, the algorithms don't work in our interest, but yet those people that promote death and destruction are promoted and put at the very, very top. And I really want to talk about these bots, okay? Ben, our YouTube channel right now is filled with bots. My Instagram posts about Cuba have been trashed with bots. Literally, it's like they've copied and pasted the same talking point over and over again, all over. They're all over our platforms right now. Ben, can you talk to me about the history of these bots? Where are they coming from? I know, Alan, you kind of touched upon it a little bit, but can you go into further detail, Ben?
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned that. I mean, it's clear we're seeing them in the comments here, and you see them everywhere. Yeah, I mean, and we have a lot of evidence of this. It's not just speculation. So if I can actually share my screen, and we'll try to do this again here. That's actually, there we go. My bad. Well, I'll get to that in a second. Actually, I shared the wrong link, but this is an example of some of the fake news being spread by not only bots, but also by right-wing politicians in the US and Latin America, sharing photos here. This is obviously a photo of a protest in Egypt in 2011. I mean, there's only hundreds of Egyptian flags in the photo. I don't know why you would think it's totally absurd. But you see all these bots spreading this kind of fake news and propaganda. But there's actually, I was meant to share this other link here. So
that picture you just showed us was shared about Cuba?
Yeah, I mean, many times that same God. Image has been shared by multiple people, and we're not just talking about like the bot accounts. I mean, the bot accounts are sharing fake photos, but we've also even seen politicians, like especially right-wing politicians in Latin America, spreading those fake images. But in terms of the bots, this is the tab I meant to share here. That this is a Spanish language report, and it's based on the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. Now, this is a very biased institution. This is an arm of the Organization of American States, which of course helped overthrow the Bolivian government in the 2019 coup attempt. It was a participant in this dirty coup campaign, claiming that there was fraud and supposedly that Evo Morales stole the election. Totally false. But even they admitted, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, that there were over 68,000 bot accounts that were created immediately before, during, and after the Bolivia coup in 2019. And if you look at, I mean, I've looked at these bots for many years now and seen these campaigns. There were similar bots on Nicaragua. They're all doing the same thing. What they do is they have these hashtags, of course, like SOS Cuba, SOS Nicaragua. They spam celebrities and influencers to try to get them to speak out. They spread the same talking points, and they spread a lot of fake news. And by the way, I'll share my screen one more time here. Is there a PR group that we can link this back to? I'm glad you asked, Mnar. Great question, because this is exactly what I was going to get up here. Okay. So this is an article I wrote. This is from 2020, and it's about this group called CLS Strategies. And I wrote this at the Gray Zone. U.S. government-linked PR firm ran fake news networks for Latin American regimes, right-wing regimes. And it talks about, I show clinically, I mean, we have evidence showing this because Facebook admitted it, and Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, admitted it, that there's this firm linked very closely to the U.S. government. It's in fact physically located a few blocks from the White House in downtown Washington. It's right next to the White House. And this firm was paid millions of dollars to spread propaganda for right-wing groups in Venezuela, supporting the U.S. coup puppet Juan Guaido, and supporting the right wing in Bolivia and the coup. And these are the governments that this firm in D.C., located right next to the White House, has worked for. All of these governments, I mean, we're talking about dozens of governments: Brazil, the Spanish government, the Colombian government, right-wing forces in Mexico, the right-wing in Argentina. I mean, they've worked for so many different governments. And let's look at some of the propaganda here. So this is according to this group run out of Stanford, which is like, I mean, they're not a very good group, the Internet Observatory. They've done all these dumb reports on like Russian bots and stuff, claiming that like, you know, all this Russiagate stuff. This is one of the only useful reports they ever did. But they acknowledge these are a bunch of different pages created on Venezuela and Bolivia that were created on Facebook and also Instagram to spread all of this fake news and all of this propaganda. And you can see some of these pages were massive: 163,000 followers, 142,000 followers. And there's an example here. They even impersonated they claim to be a former, the FAN stands for Fuerzas Armadas Nacionales, which is the National Armed Forces of Venezuela. So this is someone who's claiming to be a Chavista and a former member of the armed forces of Venezuela, spreading propaganda and fake news to demonize Venezuela. So we're talking about very sophisticated propaganda. Here, this is someone who claims to be a former military officer in Venezuela, spreading propaganda about Juan Guaido and Trump. And here's an example from Bolivia, where they're spreading coup propaganda. And here are some other accounts on Instagram. And this is all, we have evidence of this. It's not a matter of opinion. Here's this group, CLS Strategies. They actually registered with the U.S. FARA Office, Foreign Agents Registration Act. They registered to lobby on behalf of the Bolivian coup regime. So we have the receipts, we have the documents showing that these U.S. government-backed firms have created bot campaigns and propaganda for the Bolivia coup, for the Venezuelan coup attempt, for the Nicaraguan coup attempt, and they're obviously doing something now in Cuba as well.
This is the same playbook that's being used, as you said, in South America, but also the same playbook that was being used against Syria, and also to promote neo-Nazis in Ukraine. And if you argue with these people online, they are literally promoting the idea that they want their country to be starved and sanctioned. They would rather have that than the current status quo in their country.
Well, sorry to interrupt, Mnar. It's even worse. Some of them are now calling for airstrikes because in Miami, a bunch of far-right politicians are calling for U.S. invasion and for airstrikes. And there's been some articles of these Miami-based groups that are saying that they want a U.S.-style or a Syria-style humanitarian intervention in Cuba.
Yeah, that's the mayor of Miami saying that, by the way. That's not some, guy on the street. And, Anthony Sabatini, a congressman from Florida, said that the U.S. should immediately start, preparing the ground for it, and that anyone in the Cuban government that didn't immediately lay down their arms and help them transition to democracy should be put before a firing squad and executed. I mean, that's the sort of rhetoric that's coming out of elected U.S. officials on social media, and nothing is done about it.
The sadistic propaganda that is being used to promote humanitarian intervention and regime change is absolutely disgusting. I want to talk about who these people are in Miami. Any of you guys want to go and explain this to me? Alan, do you want to go on? You want to expand more on what you were just telling us about the mayor and some of the people there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I suppose Miami is often called the capital of Latin America. And it's for good reason. They've got a huge Latin American population there. Generally, it's filled up with emigres of people who used to be allied to right-wing regimes, dictatorships, a lot of them across Latin America, who once a more democratic country comes a more democratic government comes to power, they immediately flee, sometimes with millions in suitcases, and set up shop in Miami. And Cuba is no exception here. After the revolution of 1959, we saw a mass exodus of people associated with the Batista regime, his bodyguards, his security guards, his torturers, people in the military, the police, government officials, or just general business owners who had their huge farms confiscated and broken up and turned into small plots or communal gardens, or people who used to own casinos and had that taken off them, so they go over to Miami, have a very rich and fulfilling life there. And they can do that because the United States actively courts these people. So if you're a Cuban, you will have absolutely no problem getting a visa and just getting some sort of either citizenship or some sort of permanent residency in the United States. You try that if you're from Mexico or Guatemala. You're lucky if you don't end up in a concentration camp on the US border. So Cubans are given this very cushy life in comparison to the rest of Latin Americans. And that's really brought in a lot of people to Florida, and particularly to Miami. One example of how much of an echo chamber this place is that in 2013, during the Venezuelan election, which Nicolas Maduro won by about 51 to 49, the Venezuelan embassy in Miami recorded that between 95 and 99% of people casting ballots there voted for the far-right opposition candidate, Enrique Capriles Radonsky. So that's the sort of feeling you get about what the sort of political atmosphere is in Miami. I remember even in the mid-2000s, people like George W. Bush was kind of reticent to really associate with the Miami community of expats, so from Venezuela, from Cuba, from other countries, because they felt they were a bit sort of too right-wing and radical and crazy for them. So yeah, we have this sort of huge network of they are still Cubans, but either sons or daughters of Cuban emigres who have this very sort of idealized vision of what Cuba should look like. And what that really looks like is them getting back in charge. And we've now got a generation of politicians as well who've grown up on this message, people like Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio, who want to go back there, or at least see others go back there and retake their casinos, retake their farm, retake their land that they lost in 1959. And that's really the driving force behind a lot of what these people want. They're really super reactionary, and they know that ultimately, if they can't get it through these soft power things, that it's going to have to come through bloodshed. And that is what we've seen with people like Anthony Sabatini or Francis Suarez, the mayor of Miami's comments, is really their ego and their id coming out to the forefront. And because there's no one challenging that in the US, because there's not really a strong pro-Cuba, pro-Venezuela, pro-Bolivia lobby, these sorts of talking points just become natural, to the point where if you say Venezuela or Cuba is anything other than like a Nazi dictatorship destroying the world, you're seen as like some sort of outer space crazy guy from Neptune. And so yeah, these Cuban emigres really have a very good ideological use for the United States, because it allows them to develop a really strong base, a strong political base, an ideological base of people who will support the US empire no matter what, and also discipline people on the liberal left who, maybe whose sympathies might lay with these governments in Latin America, but don't dare speak out because they know they're going to get a huge amount of flack if they do. I remember the coach of, I think he was the Chicago Cubs at one point, said something that basically made it sound like Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez wasn't the worst person ever. And he was just met with an absolute deluge of hate to the point where he had to just pull it back. And so all of these, sports stars or singers or rappers or whatever, they really have to toe the line. Most of them are very willing to do so, but some that might have differing opinions are really taught and disciplined by this reactionary Cuban community that's in Miami.
Well,
and if I can add really quickly just on Miami, just having spent a lot of time there, the thing about Miami, which is incredible, is that there is, I think there's an echo.
Did you change something with your mic?
No, I didn't. Maybe, there we go. I think maybe Alan probably muted his mic. The thing about what's incredible about Miami is there is a really big working class community of immigrants. And ironically, a lot of like the elite Cuban immigrants to Miami exploit other Latinos. There's like a racial totem pole, and like the elite light-skinned Cuban elites who fled after the Cuban Revolution exploit other Latinos, and they dominate politics locally in Miami. And there's this whole, I mean, there is like a growing young movement of working class progressive Latinos who have better politics, but it's still dominated by this old money. And a lot of these people, like Alan said, who in many cases were not only big landlords, but in some cases were actually slave owners who fled Latin America, places like Cuba and the revolutions. And we should really emphasize here that this is deeply embedded within the CIA and U.S. intelligence communities, because that's another point that we really need to stress when we're talking about Miami, is that there's a very long history of the CIA using these communities as weapons against progressive forces in Latin America, just as we've seen that the U.S. government has tried to weaponize immigrant communities from Syria, from Yemen, to try to spread propaganda against the Syrian government, against the Yemeni Ansar Allah movement, and to try to create, like, to cultivate these kind of right-wing pro-imperialist, pro-war leaders and use them as proxies. Except in the case of Miami, it goes even a step further to violence. And I really want to stress this point. People need to understand that the CIA has a history of terrorist attacks in Venezuela as well, but in Cuba. So people know often about the Contra War in Nicaragua in the 1980s, in which the CIA created these terrorist armies that carried out horrible massacres against civilians and burned down schools and hospitals here in Nicaragua. Well, the U.S. did something very similar in Cuba. So in 1976, CIA-backed terrorists blew up a civilian Cuban airliner, massacring dozens of people. They also have used dozens of bombs to blow up hotels and other buildings, targeting tourism. I mean, I mentioned that earlier, but I just want to stress these points. And where is the basis of these terror attacks? In Miami. That's where the CIA recruits these far-right Cuban forces, many of them from rich, wealthy families who want to go back to Cuba and retake control of the country and the economy and have slaves again. And this is the hotbed for CIA recruitment, and they've been involved in so many different terror attacks going back decades. So we're talking about a kind of Operation Gladio style base of operations. And it's no surprise that the political climate there is so extreme. There's this new Congresswoman, Maria Elvira, what's her last name? Salazar. Maria Elvira Salazar. She filled in she just entered the Congress, and she took the seat of Eliana Ros-Lehtinen. Eliana Ros-Lehtinen had been one of like the main far-right Cuban lobby politicians, along with, of course, with Marco Rubio. And if you look at their rhetoric, I mean, it's the most extreme of the radical right wing in the U.S. So there's this kind of dialectical relationship where, just as the U.S. helped create Al-Qaeda and helped create these extremist groups to wage war against the Soviet Union in the 1980s, and then they were later repurposed against Syria and against Iran and all these other countries, there's the exact same phenomenon in Miami, to such a degree that the Miami-Dade County City Council for the county, or rather the county council, they've recently voted to declare the Sandinista Front in Nicaragua, the political party, as a terrorist organization. Wow. We're talking about, they're fascists. I mean, it's a hub for fascism, and it's not a coincidence that this hub has been pushing U.S. politics more and more right every single year. So it's a feedback loop. Just as the U.S. helped create Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan in the 1980s, they helped create these fascist movements in Latin America. And it not only pushes Latin American politics to the right, but it pushes U.S. politics to the right.
Absolutely. So basically, the expats in Miami are being repurposed, radicalized, and weaponized to push this right-wing extremism throughout Latin America, and to push that ideology here in the United States by the intelligence community. So I want to go back to kind of the root of why Cuba is a target. What makes it economically a target of the U.S. empire. Ben, can you talk about that?
Absolutely. I mean, we have some good comments. We also have a lot of trolls here, but someone asked in the comments, and I'll respond to it. It's related to your question. What makes Cuba and Haiti targets? Like, what resources do they have? And the answer is that it's not really just resources. Of course, resources are a very important thing. We even have academic studies showing that countries that have large hydrocarbons reserves like oil and gas are more than 100 times more likely to have a foreign intervention in their country. So, of course, resources are part of it. But in the case of Latin America and the Caribbean, countries like Cuba and Haiti, it's also punishing these governments that had revolutions and making sure that they can never rise again, especially if they're so geopolitically strategic for the U.S. empire. Cuba is just over about an hour and a half flight from Florida. I mean, it's extremely close to the United States. And Cuba has been a main hub for international revolutionary, progressive, and anti-imperialist movements since 1959. It's not just the threat of a good example in terms of the fact that Cuba has a lower infant mortality rate than the United States. This poor island nation that's been under a medieval blockade for 60 years has a lower infant mortality rate than the richest country on earth, the United States. Cuba has a slightly higher life expectancy than the United States, and especially in Black and Latino communities in the United States, where communities are really oppressed and there's so much poverty and few opportunities for good employment that the life expectancy is much lower in those communities. In Cuba, it's way higher. So Cuba also has free healthcare and education, which is a symbol to people around the world that, yes, you can have not only free socialized medicine, but it can be a very effective system. Cuba has created 5 COVID vaccines, this tiny blockaded country. And Cuba has sent its medical brigades during COVID to more than 30 countries around the world. Even Italy, rich countries like Italy, have been helped by Cuban doctors. Cuba also has trained, literally, it's not an exaggeration, literally hundreds of thousands of doctors around the world in dozens of countries because Cuba has medical training programs. There are even doctors in poor, largely Black and brown communities in the United States. There are doctors there who were trained in Cuba for free. So Cuba has so many programs, and also Cuba has been a major part of trying to build a political axis, a multipolar world, and trying to build international institutions that go around the chokehold that Washington and Brussels have in the international, not only financial system, but also the political system. So people might know about the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The U.S. and Brussels use these institutions to trap countries in debt. So they have to privatize all their assets. They have to do trade in the dollar. They have to pay off their debt in U.S. dollars, which means that they're beholden to the U.S. dollar. Whereas Cuba is part of a movement of other anti-imperialist countries, not only in Latin America, but also with Iran, with Belarus, with China, with Russia, with Zimbabwe, with many countries around the world to try to build new trading blocks. So you can do trade in other currencies, not just the dollar. So you can actually have a new entire political system. So they're working a lot with the United Nations right now to create a new bloc within the UN. They just launched a group that's called the Group of the Friends of United Nations Charter, and that's led by Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, China, Russia, Zimbabwe, Iran, Syria, Belarus. All these countries are working together to challenge the political and economic dictatorship led by the United States and the European Union. And that's also not only through the IMF and the World Bank, but through NATO. NATO is the political military arm. So Cuba, even though it's a small country, it punches well above its weight in international politics. And the U.S., what does the U.S. want for Cuba? The U.S. wants to turn Cuba into the Dominican Republic, a country where, with all respect to the Dominican people, I mean, they've suffered so much, and there is a resistance. But I've seen with my own eyes the horrors of the Dominican Republic, the poverty, the horrific rates of prostitution. If you walk down the street, there will be many people who will come up to you. I mean, we're talking about extreme poverty, extreme inequality, extreme racism, and violence and the Dominican Republic. We have to compare apples to apples and not apples to oranges. People always compare Cuba to a rich imperialist country like in Western Europe or the United States, which got their wealth based on colonization and exploitation and slavery. Cuba has developed its wealth totally based internally, despite the blockade. So we have to compare it to its own neighbors in Latin America and the Caribbean. And what the U.S. wants Cuba to be is like the Dominican Republic or Haiti. Basically a failed state that has no sovereignty, no control over its own affairs.
And look at, what the United States has done to Libya. It's now a failed state with, slave markets that are operating on the streets of Libya. And Libya was very similar to Cuba in the Middle East. No country is perfect, of course. Gaddafi's not perfect. But there's a lot of good things to say about what Libya was before the U.S. intervention. And so I definitely see some parallels here as to how the United States envisions the future of Cuba. It wants it to be a failed state that it can plunder and occupy. Right now, Guantanamo Bay is there, where the United States is a military base and a prison there with people in prison there through the war on terror. And so, Alan, can you talk to me a little bit about Guantanamo Bay and U.S. relationship with that?
Yeah, I suppose one of the key things that a lot of Americans have trouble wrapping their head around is that the United States is an empire. And in the late 19th century, it really finished colonizing the territorial mass of North America. And almost immediately, it started looking further afield to the Pacific, to places like the Philippines or Guam, or down to the Caribbean, places like Cuba. The US intervened in the Cuban War of Independence against the Spanish Empire in the 1890s and effectively took it over and turned it into something approaching a colony. It supported the Batista dictatorship until it fell in 1959. And part of the deal that the US struck in 1898 with Cuba was that it would forever have the rights to use Guantanamo Bay as a coaling station for some of its ships. Now, we know that that has been completely, blown out of the water. Guantanamo Bay is not used as a stopping point for, U.S. trading ships. It's used as a black site where people from all around the world can be taken, kept for years without trial, tortured all the time. Guantanamo Bay is not just, a camp. It's actually thousands of people there. In fact, it's so big that they have a McDonald's on the site. If you really need a job and you don't have that many skills, maybe apply for a job at Guantanamo Bay McDonald's. Might be an interesting place to work. I don't know. But yeah, listen, there are obviously human rights problems in Cuba. There are human rights problems in every country in the world. But what a lot of the discourse around Cuba fails to point out is that so much of the human rights problems in Cuba are actually as a result of being under this massive blockade where the world's sole superpower is constantly at its door and constantly, trying to infiltrate its media, its politics, its art scene, what have you, to the point where the Cubans have to take some sort of defensive actions. In World War II, when the United States was at war with Japan, what did they do to the Japanese Americans? They put them all in concentration camps, essentially. Now, if you're an American and you go to Cuba, you're not going to be thrown in Guantanamo Bay. But if you're from, Iraq and you get picked up at the wrong point and you were in the wrong place, wrong time, maybe you will go to Guantanamo Bay. So a lot of the human rights discourse around Cuba often, misses out the two biggest human rights problems in Cuba, which is the blockade, which is denying the rights to a better livelihood, the right to medicine, right to food to millions of people. And also this absolute monstrosity, which is at the far east of the island, which is this torture camp, which has been active for decades. And frankly, it doesn't seem like it's going to go away anytime soon, regardless of what Obama or the next president might say about closing it.
And I want to talk a little bit more about Western militarism and imperialism and why the United States, specifically Israel. And I want to do a highlight on Israel because Israel is obviously a proxy of the U.S. empire and military machine, and Israel has been one of the leading countries in its attacks against Cuba and also Venezuela as well. And so, Ben, I'm curious to know, what are Israel's interests in continuing to vote against against lifting the blockade against Cuba, and what kind of sabotage have you seen and reported on, perhaps, that Israel has taken against Cuba?
Great question. And if I can share my screen again really quickly, I just want to show, just so people visually can see. I mean, it's so striking. This vote at the UN, this was just a few weeks ago. And it shows, again, almost every country on earth, including many Western European imperialist powers, like even Britain. Yeah. Even Britain voted against the blockade, technically. I mean, we're not talking about like they're all anti-imperialist countries, but the only country that joined the U.S. in supporting the blockade of the United Nations was apartheid Israel. And of course, as you mentioned, Israel's an extension of U.S. imperialism in many ways. It was created at first as an extension of British colonialism during the British Empire with the Balfour Declaration, and then after World War II, and then especially after the Suez Crisis and the 1967 war, when Israel began attacking neighboring Arab states, then Israel really came into the U.S. camp and became a bulwark against Arab nationalism and anti-imperialist movements and communism in the so-called Middle East and West Asia. And Israel in Latin America has played a similar role. Of course, its role is not nearly as big as the U.S. simply because of geography. The U.S. often uses Israel, and they work together against other countries in West Asia, other resistance forces, which makes sense geographically. But Israel has played an important role in destabilizing and attacking progressive forces in Latin America. And in Cuba, it's not only in terms of the blockade, but also in Central America, where I am right now, it's especially clear. And Israel plays this role. And it's an example of how when the Democratic Party claims to try to do something good, it often actually doesn't change anything and can even make things even worse, actually. So in the 1980s, what happened is that back then, there used to be a few anti-war Democrats in Congress. I know it's crazy to think about now, but there were a few Democrats who were against the Reagan administration's terror war against the Sandinista government here in Nicaragua and against the progressive revolutionary socialist forces in El Salvador, the FMLN, and in other parts of Central America. The CIA created the Contra death squads, was arming and training these fascists who were massacring civilians, torturing people, burning down civilian areas. And there were a few Democrats who opposed that policy. I mean, it was partially for, opportunistic, partisan reasons because it was a Republican administration under Reagan, but they did vote against the CIA arming these Contra forces. So what happened is that the CIA simply went to Israel. And this is also true for Guatemala specifically. The Congress passed legislation because the U.S. was supporting this vicious, murderous dictatorship in Guatemala that carried out literal genocide. It was, in fact, one of the very few cases at the international court where a country has been tried and found guilty of genocide under the U.S.-backed dictatorship of Efraín Ríos Montt. He was an evangelical Christian Zionist, by the way, which partially explains the ideological links to Israel, how Israel got involved, because the U.S. also at this time was supporting right-wing evangelical forces as a counterbalance against what's called liberation theology in Latin America, because many Catholics, especially progressive Catholics, realized that these societies were deeply unfair, unequal, and that if you read the Bible, Jesus was pretty socialistic, and he threw the money lenders out of the temple, and he preached supporting the poor and helping the poor. So there were a lot of Catholics in particular who became very left-wing and even socialists and revolutionaries. So what happened is the U.S. began supporting these right-wing evangelical forces like in Guatemala, and of course, many of them were also Zionists. They saw Israel as some godly state. And so in the case of Guatemala, when the Congress passed restrictions on supporting the horrific genocidal junta in Guatemala that was getting millions of dollars of U.S. military aid per day, and that was carrying out a scorched earth genocidal campaign to massacre indigenous Maya communities in Guatemala, after the U.S. was no longer able to openly, directly arm them, what did they do? They went to Israel. And Israel did the same exact dirty work on behalf of the CIA and the U.S. government. They also did the same thing here in Nicaragua. So Israel, what it does is it helps Mossad particularly and the Israeli military. They help the U.S. military with these operations, with intelligence. They are spying on a bunch of different things. Also, Israel and the CIA have been key players in surveillance technology. Of course, still today we know that. And then, of course, Israel uses the Gaza concentration camp as a way to test new technology. But also going back to the 1980s, we know because of CIA whistleblowers like Philip Adji that the CIA and Israel and Mossad were developing surveillance technology back in the 1970s and 80s and using them in Central America and other parts of Latin America. And then what they did is that the CIA would use front groups and Mossad would use front groups, and the Israeli government would sell this technology to the dictatorships in Latin America. And then there was a back door in the surveillance technology. So the Mossad and CIA would be able to, they would sell, for instance, to the Guatemalan military junta and to the other military regimes in Latin America, like in Argentina and the Chile Pinochet dictatorship. They would sell them surveillance technology that the regimes used to spy on leftist dissidents. But at the same time, the CIA and Mossad also had a backdoor access to all of that surveillance technology. So they used it to help create this massive surveillance apparatus. Not recently, not with the NSA. We're talking about the 70s and 80s. So when we look at U.S. operations, Israel very much works hand in glove with the U.S., not only in West Asia, but also in Latin America.
Absolutely. There's an intersection I can't even talk anymore. There's an intersection between the U.S. national security state and the Israeli national security state to spy and surveil and sabotage. And, talking about all of this, I want to conclude with international law. The United States cannot be taken to the ICC because it has not ratified the ICC. It's not a signatory for the ICC. Yet we have people like Trump in the past, Mike Pompeo, and I believe John Bolton, who have directly threatened the ICC if the United States is brought to the ICC. I mean, you both have just laid out all of the human rights abuses that the United States has committed against a lot of these Latin American countries, but especially against Cuba. And then also, I want, Ben or Alan, whichever you guys prefer to speak about this. I want to talk about how can the United States be held accountable for its human rights violations? Because according to international law and under the UN Geneva Convention, it is not Cuba violating international law. It's actually the United States that's violating international law through its military operations, through its, the sanctions it has slapped on Cuba are illegal under international law. And so I want you guys to expand on this to explain how we can hold the United States accountable for its human rights abuses. I mean, people ask all the time, why can't the United States be held accountable? What is the answer to that question?
Well, I'll keep it short. I guess the point is that ultimately the world doesn't work on laws, it works on power. You were talking about the International Criminal Court. The US actually has a document called the Netherlands Invasion Act, which states that
the Hague Invasion Act,
which states that if an American official is taken to court and they attempt to try him, the US will actually invade the Netherlands to get him back, which is, an incredible statement, thinking they're both in NATO, thinking what the Netherlands is like. That's how crazy it would be just to consider that point. So, ultimately, the world, even though we have these rules and regulations, they are really meant for the poor. The rich can break them whenever they want. And so your question about how we really hold the US accountable or change the situation, it's ultimately only going to change when there is a sea change of opinion in the United States itself, which is the most important and the most powerful country in the world, bar none, and by quite a long way. And so really that really puts the onus on young Americans, people who are anti-war, people who are thinking people who, see the world as it really is, to really organize and to try and take back some of this power so we can really actually build a movement and change the US from within. Because ultimately, a lot of the people who do incredible things, these revolutionaries in Asia or Latin America that some of us have been mentioning today, ultimately their power and scope is limited because they live in the global south. People listening to this who might feel like powerless or whatever, actually you've been born at just the right time. You have a certain degree of privilege if you're watching this and you can speak and you've been educated. You actually have a considerable amount of power in your hands, even if you don't realize it. And because you have that power, I think with power comes responsibility. And so ultimately, everybody watching this has a responsibility to do everything they can to change the situation. Because if we don't do that, billions of people will continue to suffer completely needlessly. Another world is certainly possible, and it's up to people like us to make it.
Well, we have the Democratic Party who loves to just hijack those revolutions, hijack those social justice movements.
I would say it's probably not going to get changed completely just by voting for the Democrats.
Absolutely. No, and I agree with you, Alan. And actually, I feel very inspired by what you just said, because I tend to agree with you on that. The problem is that we have the very powerful Democratic Party who, very much presents itself as this, arm of resistance and socialist and, for social justice. Look what happened to the Black Lives Matter movement. A lot of the leaders are very much aligned with the Democratic Party and people like Joe Biden, who wrote the crime bill, who basically built the infrastructure in this country to build like the prison industrial complex and the police state. And the same thing with Kamala Harris. And so I believe that there is a lot of hope within the people, but there's also this infrastructure that's built in the United States by the Democratic Party, which pushed neoliberal economic policies and ideas through social media tech giants who basically control the narrative. So we have to really break through all of that for real change to happen, which is why it's so important to support independent media and journalism. And there's literally we're just a small handful of outlets and people who truly see the world through the lens of Western imperialism. Ben, did you want to add anything on those points before we wrap up?
No, I mean, I think you both engaged with it really well. You said exactly what I was going to say. I would just add that it's really important for anyone watching this who's a U.S. citizen to understand that if you really want to help the Cuban people, as Mexican President AMLO said, you can lift the blockade. That's the most important thing that people watching this should understand, because that is the most important factor in the economic problems in Cuba. And if people say they care so much about Cuban lives, then it's very easy to support those Cuban lives and support the Cuban economy and the illegal criminal U.S. blockade. And the last thing I want to say is that there's this idea. I saw Ana Kasparian from TYT claimed that Obama lifted the blockade. That's not true. That's totally false. Obama, yes, he normalized diplomatic relations with Cuba and lifted some sanctions, but the blockade was not lifted. In fact, the Obama administration at the same time began imposing sanctions on Venezuela, which led to a total blockade of Venezuela right now, which is based on the blockade of Cuba. So the Democratic Party, it's not like if Joe Biden looking at his statement, he's openly supporting these protests, obviously, and trying to further destabilize the Cuban government. But even let's say I don't think this is going to happen, but let's be generous and say that maybe he goes back to the Obama era policies. That's not nearly enough. Where all they did was normalize diplomatic relations while continuing to try to destabilize Cuba, while continuing to fund these groups like the so-called San Isidro movement, which is one of this U.S. government-funded AstroTurf group that's behind a lot of these protests. It's still gone on. So we need to have an actual end to the blockade and all sanctions, not just a normalization of political relations. It's not nearly enough. Absolutely. And we should stop whitewashing the Obama years, because unfortunately, there are a lot of people who, especially kind of like soft liberals, they might acknowledge that the U.S. has negative policies against Cuba, but they act as though those are all Trump's fault. And yes, Trump did impose many more sanctions on Cuba that have really hurt the Cuban people, but it's a bipartisan problem very much, and we have to totally break with that bipartisan policy.
Well, and that's exactly it. It's a bipartisan policy that no matter who's in office, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, they just continue that policy. In fact, they just expand that policy even further. The next president that comes just, takes off where the last president left off. And so that's a wrap for today's MintCast live stream. Again, we were live on YouTube, Twitch, Facebook. This will be available on our YouTube channel after this conversation is done, and on our Facebook. And it will be available as a podcast, audio podcast, on the MintCast account on Spotify and iTunes. Thank you both gentlemen so much. That was such a wealth of information. I really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you.
Yeah, it was good to be with you. Also, one last thing, big up the Grey Zone. Everybody should go there and bookmark it, and also subscribe to the Moderate Rebels podcast as well.
Absolutely. So
thank you, Alan.
Of course, follow the Grey Zone and follow our work, and make sure to support all of the independent media outlets, including Mint Press and the Grey Zone, on our Patreon pages. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, I'll add, everyone go to Mint Press News and support Mint Press. Everyone give your money to Mint Press.
Thank you so much.
One of the best websites out there. We are very happy at the Grey Zone to have friends and comrades over at Mint Press, and look forward to working together more in the future.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ben. That's very humbling. Thank you guys so much. Have a good day.
Good to speak with you.